Thank you all for taking advantage of this. I'm Scott Talley with Network and Action Corporate, along with Daniela Rojas there. And we're glad you're all here. We're going to jump right in. I have the easiest job in the world. When I get out to recruit speakers, we have the sales mastery classes we're offering on the third week of each month. So let me review that just real quickly. We want to make sure we're bringing you lots of value. So on the first week of each month on Wednesday at 3 o'clock Central, to 4:15, 4:30, we have Network with the Nation. And that's where if you can offer products or services across state lines, you'll want to jump on that. We just jump into breakout rooms for an hour and a half. That's the first Wednesday of every month. The third Wednesday of every month, we now have Sales Mastery. And that again starts at 3 o'clock Central Time and runs to about 4:15. We have great speakers each month. And then the fourth Wednesday of each month, which we've changed to Wednesday to stay consistent, 3 o'clock Central again, we have our speaker series. And this month we've got none other than Mr. Dan Kelso. Dan is the owner of the Kelso Group in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a firm that primarily works with business owners and organizations to help them grow their business. And a buddy of mine introduced us, and I was introduced to Dan's book, and I was like, wow, this is right on for so many entrepreneurs. So I twisted Dan's arm. No, I didn't have to. He was happy to oblige. Dan is with us today to talk about his best-selling book, Overcoming the Imposter. Dan, thanks for being with us from Nashville, Tennessee, right?
Yeah, Scott, and it's pronounced Kris. So it may look like Dan, but it's pronounced Kris.
Did I say Dan Kelso the whole time? Oh, I know a Dan Kelso. Oh my gosh.
That's okay.
It doesn't look
figured
a
it was
thing
something like
Dan.
that.
This is what happened. I'm going to blame this on my late flight. I flew back from California last night. I was supposed to leave Vegas at 8 o'clock and I left at 12:40. So I got in at my house at 4:20 this morning. Now I'm going to blame it on something else. I can't be accountable. My bad. Sorry about that, Kris.
No, it's no problem at all. You can call me just about anything you want to. And
as long as I call you to dinner, my dad used to say.
That's
call
right.
Me you want, just call me to dinner.
Don't call me late for dinner. Absolutely.
All right, Kris. It's all yours. Sorry about that.
Man, thanks, Scott. I'm so glad to be here and glad to see so many great faces. I would love to see your faces if you're in a place where you can and are willing to be on video and be visible. I would also love to interact with you all a little bit. I don't want this just to be me talking for an hour because I don't want to hear that. And I assume that that you don't want to hear me talk for an hour straight either. So the first thing I'd love is if everybody would put in the chat where you're watching us from, where you're joining in from, where in the world are you, city, state, country, if you're outside of the US, let us know where you're at. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, God's country here in Middle Tennessee. And the weather is beautiful today. Let's see, we got New Jersey, we got Ohio, we got Minnesota, we got Fargo, North Dakota, Dallas, Texas, San Diego. Awesome. So good to see so many people from all over the place. Atlanta, excellent. Yakima, Washington, very nice. All right, good stuff. Dixon, Tennessee. Ooh, Dixon, not far from me, Deborah. Nice to meet you. Winnipeg, excellent. Well, my name is Kris Kelso. I'm an entrepreneur, have been for really the majority of my adult life. I've founded a couple of different companies. I've gotten to work with investors. I've gotten to teach classes on entrepreneurship. I mentor and coach a lot of small business owners and have done some really fun things in my career. But there's one part of my story that doesn't often get told when someone is doing an intro or a bio or an overview of me and my history. And that little detail is that for a lot of my career, I really didn't feel qualified to do what I was doing. In fact, a lot of the time I was just learning as I went. I was just making it up as I go along. And so by way of background, you should know about me. I started my first business when I was in my early 30s, about 31 years old, and I had no business training or education whatsoever. I don't even have a college degree. I never went to college, never taken a single college class. And so I remember going to a large bookstore and buying a stack of books. And I still have stacks of books. Some of those books are still on my shelf behind me, but I bought a stack of books covering anything that I thought I needed to know to run a small business. Finances, legal, contracts, sales, marketing. I just bought a bunch of books and started reading, and I got to work. And those first few years in business, I launched an IT consulting firm. My background is in technology. And those first few years in business, almost everything I did, I was doing for the first time. So I was landing clients and writing contracts, and I was managing these large projects. We ended up designing and building data centers and doing all kinds of mergers and acquisitions work. And so it was all a learning experience for me. And I love to learn. And so I enjoyed it immensely. And many times I needed to know something or figure something out, and I just figured out a way to learn it in real time as I was doing it. But every now and then, somebody would refer to me as an expert in something, and I would start to feel a little guilty. I would be introduced as an expert, and I would think, have I pulled the wool over somebody's eyes? Have I unintentionally deceived someone? Because I didn't always feel like an expert. And there was this voice in the back of my head that would try to tell me that it wasn't real, that it wasn't legitimate, that I really didn't know what I was doing. And so one day in my learning journey, I learned about this thing called imposter syndrome, right? And for those of you that may not be familiar, imposter syndrome is a term that was coined in the 1970s, and it refers to the tendency of many people, it turns out, to overvalue other people's accomplishments and to undervalue or even doubt the reality of their own accomplishments. And what happens when you have imposter syndrome is you look at other people and say, well, Scott is really successful because he's educated and he's smart and he seems to be really savvy and he knows what he's doing. He's got a great plan and he executes it well and he seems to make all the right moves. Whereas my success, on the other hand, has involved a lot of luck, a lot of timing, a lot of maybe just happening to know the right people. For instance, I'll give you an example. When I started my consulting firm, my very first client was a man who used to be my boss. He was my boss in a former company. And in fact, it was almost 3 years before I landed a client that wasn't the result of some relationship from my past. Now, you might think that I would see that as a strength, because it meant that the people that had worked for me in the past wanted to continue to work with me again and again and again. But I saw it as a weakness. I saw it as a limitation because I wasn't winning clients the way I thought it was supposed to be done, the way I'd seen other people do it with a formal and disciplined sales process. And so the underlying fear of imposter syndrome is that sooner or later, everyone is going to figure out that you don't really know what you're doing, that you're just figuring it out as you go along, that you're making it up as you go. And that if that happens, if anyone figures that out, that you're going to be exposed as a fraud and it's all going to come crumbling down around you. Let's be honest. Has anybody ever felt that way? Anybody willing to admit that you felt that way? Yes, I see some hands. So I used to literally imagine that one day I would be sitting in a room full of very educated business people and, MBAs all around. And I'd be sitting in this room and someone would bring up a model or a principle that was taught on the very first day of business school, which of course I did not attend. Right. And so he would say something like, well, of course we can't do that because of the Thompson Principle. Kris, you know the Thompson Principle, right? And then the entire room would turn and look at me, waiting for me to give some commentary on the Thompson Principle. And so I would stammer around and, sweat would form on the back of my neck. And I would try to say something intelligent about the Thompson Principle until it became totally evident to everybody that I had no idea what that was. And then at some point, some men in black suits in dark sunglasses would come in and say, "Excuse me, sir, you're going to have to come with us. You don't belong here." And so, of course, that never happened to me. And by the way, if you're wondering what the Thompson Principle is, you can stop worrying or Googling if you're searching for it. There is no Thompson Principle. I literally just, I made that up. But that feeling that you may have had for just a brief moment of, is there something that everyone else knows that I don't know? Am I the only one who doesn't know what he's talking about? That worry is part of what I'm talking about. So, that scenario never quite played out that dramatically, but for years, I had this nagging voice in the back of my head that would try to convince me that my success wasn't real, that I wasn't legitimate. And the voice would say things like, you're not a real business owner. You're just a guy doing some consulting. You never would have landed that first client if it wasn't for your old boss throwing you a bone. These people think you know what you're talking about, but you don't know what you're talking about. You just know how to sound like you know what you're talking about. Sometimes it would say things like, you're the only person who doesn't deserve to be sitting at this table or a part of this group. And even as my business grew and I had more success, that voice would change tactics. It would say things like, your business isn't a real business until you have employees. Your business isn't a real business until you have a physical office space. Oh, your business isn't a real business until you have $1 million in revenue. And your business isn't a real business until you have a full management team in place. And so no matter what I achieve, no matter what accomplishment I might have, that inner critic, that voice in my head would find some other milestone or some other achievement that I hadn't yet hit to try to use against me to prove that I hadn't made it yet. I hadn't succeeded and that my success wasn't real. It was just an illusion. And maybe you felt this way too. In fact, studies have shown that up to 70 or 80% of the population has experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their career, and that it tends to be more prevalent among high achievers. So the more driven you are, the more ambitious you are, the more likely you are to get in a situation where you feel like you might be in over your head or you might be unqualified to do what you're doing. But just because it's a really common phenomenon doesn't mean that it's always the same experience for everybody. See, there's not just one set of issues or insecurities that people with imposter syndrome deal with. For you, education may not be an issue like it was for me, but there may be some other part of your story or part of your past that makes you feel like you don't measure up or you don't fit in, right? Maybe you're not a gifted communicator. Maybe speaking to a group like this, if we turned your mic on and said, tell everyone your story, maybe that's terrifying to you. And you feel like that makes you less than, or that holds you back. On the other hand, maybe you're a really great communicator and you feel like, I may have gotten by more on my charisma than on my actual effort and merit. Maybe I can talk myself into situations that I don't deserve to be in. On the other hand, there may be some other aspect of your relationship building. Perhaps you're not very well connected. You don't come from a well-connected family. You don't feel like you have a lot of relationships in the business community, and you feel like that holds you back or that puts limits on you. And yet, on the other hand, some of you may be really well connected and feel like that your connections are sort of a crutch, that you've leveraged other people more than yourself, and that those relationships have actually put you in situations that you wouldn't have been able to get into on your own. So you see, it's not the same situation. It's not the same challenge for everybody. It's a very common feeling, but the specific part of your story that inner critic will use is going to be unique and different, and can even be the opposite of what someone else is experiencing. So I want to share us one slide real quick. This is some examples, kind of like the ones that I just shared, of some narratives that I've heard from people that are, and notice that there are opposites on this board. The left and right are some opposite statements. And these are things that make people feel like they're less than. These are some of the insecurities that some people have struggled with in their career. And so what I want to ask you to do right now is I'd love for a volunteer or two who are willing and bold enough to either turn on your mic and share what has been your experience with this. What has that voice in your head told you is your weakness? And either jump in, and I see Scott's already come off mute, so he's going to jump in and share with us, or maybe put something in the chat if you want to tell a little bit of your story. Scott, what do you got?
Well, I'm laughing, and this is maybe I shouldn't be this honest, but I was looking forward to today so much, because here's where we are real quickly. We are one of the fastest growing franchises in North America. There's 4,300, only 1% ever get to 100 ever. We got there in 5 years. We have 400 groups around the country, people joining every day. And I lay in bed at night wondering if this is going to work 7 years in.
Yes. Is today going to be the day that it all falls apart? Right?
Does this really work?
Yeah. Yeah. Incredible. Who else?
But in a way, I just want to say this, that's a negative, because you can't just enjoy the journey. The positive is it keeps you motivated to keep trying to figure out how you can help people, in our relationship.
It does. That's a good point. And the opposite of imposter syndrome can be hubris, right? Feeling like, oh, I got this. I'm fine. No problem. I can do anything. And that can definitely get you in trouble too. In fact, a little bit later, I'm going to talk about how we can turn this around, and it actually can be a positive instead of a negative. Awesome. Monica, I see your hand raised.
I can raise my hand.
Yeah, thank you so much. So for me, because my last name is Sanchez and my maiden is Santillanes, people automatically assume I speak Spanish. And I've been ridiculed. This is me being vulnerable here, but since I was a kid, either I wasn't Mexican enough or I wasn't white enough. And when I would speak Spanish, people would say, you don't know what you're saying, and you talk like a white girl. And then when I wouldn't speak Spanish, they'd say, are you not proud of your heritage? And they would shun me. So either way, I was always getting shunned. So that's been a big barrier for me, and I'm working through it as I have a life coach, and this is wonderful. So thank you for the opportunity.
You're so welcome, Monica, and thank you for sharing that. One of the questions that I often get asked, because I have studied imposter syndrome now for several years, and I wrote a book on the subject, which you can see behind me, and it talks a lot about particularly entrepreneurs and how they battle with imposter syndrome. But one of the questions I get often is imposter syndrome more prevalent among men or women? Like, is it gender specific, or does it happen more among minorities or people from other cultures? Is it an American phenomenon? And I can tell you, after having spoken about this all over the world and to all kinds of different people, it is universal. Now, it happens equally among men and women. Women do tend to be more open to talk about it and more honest about it, but statistically, there's no difference between men and women. And in terms of minorities or majority groups or race or culture, those kind of things, what I would say is it doesn't happen more often, but it happens differently. So for instance, what you just shared with us, I'm not going to struggle with imposter syndrome for those same kind of reasons, because I don't have that particular life experience. I'm not going to wrestle with those issues, but that doesn't mean that I haven't had my own insecurities, my own struggles. So that's where I say it's a very common experience that is very personalized and very tailored to each person. Was there another hand? Kimberly. Oh, that's an applause. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Oh, applause and a hand. Hi.
Yeah.
Mine is a combination of, I don't have a college degree and I'm just getting by with my hard work. So it's kind of a combination. School was not my thing and I kind of struggled, but I've always been a driven, hard person. But I'll tell you what, hard work really pays off. There's a lot of people that have degrees that don't do great, or they're not that ambitious and things like that. But that would be I get by with my hard work and my drive.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been interesting, I used to be ashamed of the fact that I didn't have a college degree. I would try to not mention that and keep that a secret and just, avoid that subject. And now it's almost a source of admiration for people. When they hear that I don't have a college degree, they say, "Oh, wow, that's impressive what you've done, what you've accomplished without that." It's just funny how the perspective can be so different. And what we fear, what we feel like is holding us back is often, not what we think it is, or not the problem or challenge that we think it is. Well, thank you all for sharing. I appreciate that very much. So let's talk a little bit more about this, this experience of imposter syndrome. And I want to share a story. A few years, actually, it's been many years ago now. I was sitting in a hotel lobby, waiting for the start of a conference that I had flown in to attend. And I couldn't help but overhear a conversation going on between two men that were sitting at the table right next to me. So I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but they're just talking, and one of these men was obviously a businessman and was several years, maybe even a couple of decades older than I was at the time. And as I listened to him talk, he said things like, "I'm really trying to slow down. I'm really trying to get more in touch with my family. And I've flown all over the world and I've done these huge business deals and I've made millions of dollars. But now my marriage is strained and I barely have a relationship with my kids." And man, as I listened to this guy's story, several things ran through my mind. The first was, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that I never, ever say that, right? My family is really, really important to me. And I don't want to achieve professional success at the expense of my family relationships. So I was listening to the story and thinking, all right, I've got to figure out what boundaries to put into my life. And I had two realizations that morning. The first one is that all success comes at a cost. Okay, success requires sacrifice. And it's really, really important to recognize that and to be intentional about the sacrifices that you're willing to make for your success. And that's different for everybody, right? We each have our own set of priorities and values and what's important to us, but you've got to make those choices intentionally and not let them just happen. So the first realization was success comes at a cost. The second realization was that I usually have no idea what another person has chosen to sacrifice in pursuit of their success. So had I compared myself to that man professionally as a businessman without knowing that part of his story, I might have felt really inferior. I might have felt like I couldn't measure up because I couldn't achieve what he achieved while maintaining my own personal boundaries. And I'm not telling you this story to try to deride anyone else's success. And I'm certainly not trying to give you a lesson on making the right choices, right? Your values are your values, and what's important to you is important to you. What I'm trying to point out is that it is a trap to compare yourself to someone else. That anytime you compare yourself to someone else, that you measure yourself up against someone else, you're comparing the reality of your own life to a very polished and filtered version of someone else's life. It's a trap. It's what I call the comparison trap. And President Teddy Roosevelt said that comparison is the thief of joy. You can feel great about yourself until you look at another person and you either want what they have, or you wish you'd achieved what they've achieved, or you could do what they've done. And I have seen so many successful people fall into the comparison trap, right? I give you some examples. I know a woman who started her company grew it over a decade, more than a decade. And when I met her, she had a really growing business. She was raising up a management team to run the company. She was operationalizing. She had a multi-million-dollar business with great profit margins, but she secretly didn't feel like she could really call herself a CEO because no one gave her that title. She gave it to herself. She just started the company and became the CEO by default. So in her mind, she didn't earn it because it wasn't given to her. And literally just down the street, I'm not speaking metaphorically, down the road, there's another business owner that I know who doesn't feel like a real entrepreneur because he didn't start his business from scratch. He bought it from someone else. Now, he has revamped the business model. He's taken a stagnant company and got it growing profitably again. I mean, it's almost a complete remake, and he's disrupting his industry with this business that he acquired. But he doesn't quite feel legit because he didn't do it the way he saw other people do it. So when we let that voice inside of our heads, that inner critic, when we let that voice take these false narratives, these lies about our value and the realities of our story, when we let it take those things and warp them and use them against us, we take the things that should give our story a flavor and a texture that no one else's has, because it makes us unique. And we let that voice of the inner critic weaponize those things against us and steal our joy. By the way, I have grown to call that voice inside my head the imposter. All right. It's been called many things by many people: the inner critic, the gremlin, the voice of the saboteur. But I started calling it the imposter, not because it's trying to convince me that I'm an imposter, which it often is, but really to remind me that that voice in my head isn't real. There's no one there. That voice is the imposter. It's a fake. So that's why I called this book Overcoming the Imposter. It's overcoming your own personal inner critic in your life. So I want to ask another question. Going back to the Thompson Principle, has anyone had a story or an experience of a thing like that you felt like, this is something I should know that I don't, and I'm afraid to say so? I'm afraid to admit that I don't know something. I'll share one other story with you about that. I was working with a bunch of startups, a bunch of entrepreneurs who were building companies, and they were preparing to pitch their business ideas to investors, kind of like Shark Tank, if you've ever watched that show. And so there was a lot of talk among these entrepreneurs about getting a term sheet. Now, a term sheet, if you're not familiar with that, is simply a document, usually 1 or 2 pages, that outlines the terms of an investment deal. It's sort of the first offer in an investment deal. And then it's followed up by a big long contract that spells out all the legalese. But the term sheet is sort of that offer they do on Shark Tank, where they say, I'm asking for this amount of money for this amount of equity, or I'm offering you this amount of money for this amount of equity in your company. And so I'm working with these entrepreneurs, and there's all this talk about term sheets. And here's the thing: at this time, this was years ago, I had never actually seen a term sheet. And so while I understood what it was in principle, I didn't know what one physically looked like the layout. If you asked me to write one up or to, sketch it out, I'd never seen one before. And I was so afraid to admit that to anybody. And so I went to a friend of mine who was also an entrepreneur and was raising money for his company. He had a startup and was in the middle of that process. And I said, hey, can I take a look at your term sheet? And he said to me, it's pretty straightforward. There's nothing special about it. And I couldn't bring myself to admit to even my friend that I did not know what standard meant. I didn't know what straightforward was. And so I was stuck because I was so afraid to acknowledge that I didn't know something. Any other example? Anybody brave enough to raise your hand and say, I've been there? Steve.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. You got it right.
Yes,
tons of times, no doubt about it. I just can't recall any specific thing right now, but absolutely. I mean, I did one kind of funny story, and I really appreciate your humor, by the way. I was on stage with my sister in front of an audience of a couple thousand people, and she had positioned me as a product expert in an introduction. And in that moment, I just was like, I don't see myself as an expert by any means, but I do know about nutrition. And so it was like just a bit of a pause and regrouping. And then they just went back, to get back on track into the presentation. But I totally can relate to a lot of what you're saying.
Yes. Most of us have been in that situation. Like, what somebody just put me on a pedestal and I'm afraid of falling off of it. Right. Yes. So let me talk to you about some tactics, some practical things that happen when you're experiencing imposter syndrome.
Hold on one sec, Kris. I think somebody was that who wanted to say something there. Ashley?
Was there another one?
Yeah. Go ahead, Ashley.
Ashley, yeah, go ahead.
Come on.
Hi, I just wanted to kind of share my spot. I'm in the mortgage field and I'm a little bit younger, but I've obviously done my education, taken the time for my licensing, and everybody's certain situation is different. So I feel like every day you come across something that you don't know.
Yes.
And I think it's a very scary thing because you don't go through the same thing every day. It's not open and closed because everybody's financial situation, products, they're different for everybody.
You're not just turning a wrench and cranking out a widget. You're navigating unique situations all the time.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit newer to the field, so it's really good for the learning aspect of it, but it's every day. I feel like it's something new to come across.
My only comment is I really applaud you at your age for jumping on things like this, because it's so easy just to be working on a mortgage, but this is where you're going to expedite your whole entire growth. So way to go.
Yeah.
Randy, you had something? That's not Randy. Go.
Yes, it's Randy.
Okay.
Randy.
I'm using Jason Wheeler's account. That's why I change my name every time.
Oh, okay.
That's why my name really is Randy. Okay, so I probably have, I don't have time to evaluate my entire life, but basically I probably have felt imposter syndrome more than I've not felt imposter syndrome. Like in other words, I grew up kind of being criticized for almost everything and anything, and my parents were good people, but they didn't necessarily see the value in edifying too much. But
that's very graceful.
Yes, very diplomatic.
I tell people after 50 years of personal development, I've become normal. But anyway,
nice.
The thing is, though, that there have been a few times in my life when I have actually felt kind of like maybe not master of the entire game worldwide, but certainly where I've felt that there have been some spikes or some pockets of excellence or expertise or great accomplishment or whatever. Unfortunately, those periods of time don't tend to be short-lived, and it hasn't translated into a snowball effect. But nonetheless, I'm just saying that I am working to overcome this type of phenomenon, and I appreciate your presentation very much. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. You're welcome. The interesting thing about that, Randy, is if you're the type of person that wants to learn one thing and then do it a million times for the rest of your life, then you're unlikely to encounter imposter syndrome for very long or very often. But if you are like me, I'm a person who loves to do new things. I love to learn. I love to stretch. I love to grow. In fact, when I get mastery of something, I immediately start to get bored with it. And I want to go on to the next hill to climb, the next obstacle, the next learning journey. And so if you're a person who's always going to be learning, you're going to regularly find yourself on that cycle that you described of, man, I feel like I really got it together. And then all of a sudden I feel like I don't know what I'm doing again. And it's because you're trying new things, right? And so that's one of the ways that it actually is a positive sign, not a negative sign, because it means you're pushing yourself. It means you're stretching and you're growing. So let's talk about the learning journey for a little bit, because I think this touches on what Randy said as well as what Ashley just said. One of the tactics of the imposter, that voice in your head, one of the tactics that it will do is to prey on your fears, and in particular, your fear of failure. All right, so when we're afraid of failing, when we're worried about getting something wrong, it's going to cause us to be really conservative, really risk averse. It's going to cause us to shrink back instead of leaning forward. But failure is not something that we should be afraid of. In fact, failure is a great teacher. We learn more from failures than we do from success. And so there's a famous story among IBM employees of Tom Watson Jr. when he was running IBM. This was many, many years ago. He was running IBM and he called a vice president into his office to talk about a failed development project that this VP was in charge of that had cost the company somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 million. Now that would be over $100 million today in today's money. And actually with inflation, probably 150 million by the time we're done with this talk. But so I want you to just imagine that for a moment, that you're going into the CEO's office to talk about $100 million failure. What do you think that VP had in his hand when he walked in that room?
Pink slip.
His resignation.
He had his resignation letter in hand because he assumed that's what the conversation was going to be about. And Tom Watson took the letter from the man and he looked at it and he looked up at the man and he looked at the letter and then he just shook his head and he said, "Why would we let you go? We just invested millions of dollars in your education." See, Tom Watson knew the valuable wisdom that comes through failure. He understood that that's a good way to learn. And he wasn't about to see all of that learning walk out the door and go to a competitor, which is exactly what would have happened if they let that guy go. And so I have really learned to think of failure very differently. I have several mantras, and you'll hear a few of them today, but one of them is that failure is only truly failure if you learn nothing. And so when I go to take on something new, when I go to try something, when I'm taking a risk or I'm getting out of my comfort zone, I tell myself that there's only two options, only two outcomes. I'm either going to succeed or I'm going to learn. One of those things is going to happen. And either way, it's a win for me. So let's talk about another example. How many of you have heard of a guy named Babe Ruth? Pretty much everyone, right? Even if you're not a baseball fan, you've heard of Babe Ruth. He is one of the greatest baseball players of all time. Many consider him the greatest. And in fact, he held so many Major League Baseball records. Many of them still stand today, years after he's gone. He had a nickname that was the Sultan of SWAT. And it was because of his home run hitting. He held the home run record. He had RBI records. He had all kinds of slugging records. And yet there's another nickname that he had that not a lot of people remember. His other nickname was the King of Strikeouts. Did you know that Babe Ruth held the Major League Baseball record for career strikeouts? 1,330 times he struck out. And that record stood for 30 years until it was beaten by a guy named Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle took the strikeout record from Babe Ruth. So just process that for a minute. So clearly these guys were not afraid of failure. And in fact, the reason that they had so much success is that they saw failure as part of the process of success. They knew that if you don't take big swings and take some risks, you're never going to hit those big home runs. And I can guarantee you that every time they struck out, they were learning something. If you know baseball, you know that it's a sort of a chess match between the batter and the pitcher about trying to learn the pitcher's tendencies and tells and what he's going to throw next. And so every time one of those guys struck out, they were learning things that were going to help them get their next home run. And so I have learned to reframe failure as a learning process that is part of my success. My success in my career and in my life is built on what I have learned from my failures. So I'm going to open it up again to the group. Can you think of a failure in your past that has led to your success because of what you've learned from it? Shannon?
Shannon, go ahead.
So it's not failure per se, but I've been recruited into some jobs that turned out to not be as presented.
Yeah.
And I've been, I am driven to succeed at all I do. And I made it successful, but man, it was really miserable. And there was a period of going from help grow a company and do that. But what I learned in hindsight, from no matter how toxic those places were, had I not had that experience, I wouldn't have the qualifications for a job that I was recruited in 2 to 3 times after that.
Yeah.
Right. And so what I've learned is my career kind of looks like, and no offense, a millennial. I've been in all these different industries being recruited in. And while that may look bad to some entrepreneurs, many take a look at it of the experience I bring with me of each. Yeah. And so while not a failure, it felt like bad decisions, but they all led to the next. They all led to where I am today. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you drew something from each of those mistakes, those wrong jobs. You took something away that became the stepping stones in your career towards something great. Yeah. Moose, I see your mic is open. Did you have something to add?
I grew up, my dad ran a very popular radio station here in Houston, and I followed in his footsteps in 1974. It took me to markets like Shreveport, Louisiana, San Antonio to start, Shreveport, Louisiana, Reno, Lake Tahoe, Nevada. I've worked for some really good people, and then I worked for corporate America who were not good people. They didn't give a rat's fanny about anything other than hitting budgets, and I was required to let people go that helped me get to $7.5 million a year. I had a market manager that came in that I had a bullseye on my back from the minute that they, I won't say gender, but when they got there, that because of my last name and the success that we had, I was not good at Excel, okay? But I was really good at going a million, getting, $500,000, dollar contracts from advertisers. My skill set was not sitting in meetings all day long. My skill set was really being out, talking with business people about growing their business. New York, Viacom New York, CBS Radio did a nationwide sweep of what we would call middle managers. So I lost my role, got eliminated, and that was my identity. Radio was what I did, but it wasn't just me. It was 50 some other what we would call station managers were replaced by were replaced by market managers, whatever. It took me a long time to figure out what I wanted to be after that. Chased a lot of different things. And, we called it unanswered prayers, became answered, because when Scott introduced me to network and action as a concept in 2014, I was like, I don't know. I'm not ready. I really have a good digital marketing business. And, it was taking that leap of faith. I became the very first franchise owner in April of 2015. And now I have 4 groups. I'm having the time of my life. I just saw John Maxwell. He posted a video about passion, your why. And there's anybody can either quit from a career, but if it's your calling and you're passionate about what you do, that will be with you forever. So I'm thankful that I didn't kill anybody. I didn't go to jail because I couldn't stand it. And that it turned out okay. Yeah. That at the end of the day, I'm so much better off with what I'm doing today, making people happy instead of living in a life where nobody was happy. And, we built a great radio station, but at the end of the day, even 10,000 a month to 7.5 million a year was never enough for CBS, which answered to Viacom. So, it just, and I love this. If you don't take the swing, you will always miss. So
that's right.
I'm blessed to live the life that I do. So thank you. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. And you can, to build on what Shannon put in there, you can strike out looking, right? You just stand there and don't ever take the risk, and you still strike out and you go. Thanks for sharing that, Moose. I appreciate that.
It's not easy, but it's the reality.
So I want to make sure I'm watching the clock and want to make sure we have time to get to the next tactic. Because the first tactic is to make you fear failure, right? That voice will try to keep you in a box, try to keep you from taking any risks, make you ultra safe and conservative, and never try anything new, never put yourself in a vulnerable situation. And it'll also try to convince you that you have to hide your failures. And when you sweep your failures under the rug, you rob yourself and the people around you of that valuable wisdom that comes through those failures. That learning gets lost when you try to just forget about it. So that's the first tactic. But the second tactic of the imposter is going to be to try to isolate you, right? So that voice is going to make you afraid of failure, and it's going to try to convince you that you're all alone, that no one else experiences what you're experiencing, that no one else, that your problems are yours alone, and that everybody else has got it figured out, and you're the only one that doesn't. Now, have you ever watched one of those nature programs where they break down the hunting strategy of like a pack of wolves or a family of cheetahs? Or, I love those shows, Planet Earth and stuff like that. And I used to watch those with my kids when they were younger. And if you've ever watched a pack hunter like a wolf, what they will do is they'll identify from a herd of animals. They'll identify one that is small or weak that they think they can go after. And the first thing they want to do is isolate it from the herd. See, there's safety in the herd, right? There's safety in those numbers. There's safety in that connection in those relationships. But when they get it isolated, then they can overwhelm it. They can run it down. They can exhaust it. They can maneuver around and try to attack. And the imposter will do the same thing. Try to get you to separate from other people so that your perspective is wrong, is limited, so that you get wrapped up in your own world, so that that voice in your head becomes louder than the voices around you. But we need community, right? And this is why I love groups like Network in Action and other kind of peer networking groups and organizations that help connect people so that you're not stuck on your own, so that you're not just feeling isolated. And when you are in a challenging time, when you're struggling, you have other people to connect with you and to hold you up and encourage you. But let me tell you something, that the benefits of community are not automatic. All right. There's an ingredient. There's one thing that can make the difference as to whether community works for you or against you when it comes to imposter syndrome. I'll give you a story to illustrate this. I met with a young entrepreneur years ago, and he had founded his company right out of college. And he had landed some investment money from a big name investor, like somebody, if I said his name, you would know who he is. And he was telling me about his business, and he was giving me the sales pitch. Now, entrepreneurs in particular and I've been an entrepreneur a lot for most of my adult life, and entrepreneurs are almost always in sales mode, right? They're always telling you that things are great, things are awesome. If they're not selling you as a customer, they might be selling you as a potential investor or a potential partner or a vendor or somebody who they might want to join the team. So they're just sort of always in hype mode and selling their vision of what they're trying to build. And so he was giving me that. He was telling me how great it was, but I just could sense, I could tell that behind the sales pitch, there was some stress. There was some anxiety. There was some insecurity. And so I did something. I just started to really open up with this young man. And I told him a little bit about my own journey. I told him some of my story, and not just my successes, but my struggles, my fears, my worries as an entrepreneur. I just talked to him about real life as a business owner. And his eyes began to tear up. And he said, Kris, this is the first real conversation that I've had with anyone about how hard this is. See, he was struggling to measure up to all the other confident, successful entrepreneurs that he saw around him. He was in the comparison trap, totally. And there are lots of entrepreneurial communities and entrepreneurial events and entrepreneurial organizations you can join, but he was going to those things and it was feeding his imposter syndrome because everybody was on and he felt like everybody has it together and I don't, because there was a lot of flaws in his plan. There was a lot of cracks beneath the surface. He was like a duck, on the water, calm and cool on top and paddling like crazy underneath. And when I opened up to him, when I just got real honest and when I was vulnerable with him, it was like I extended him a lifeline and I gave him hope. And so I want to challenge all of you as you're networking, as you're building relationships, as you're finding communities that you can be a part of, look for the opportunities to be and to encourage vulnerability. Because if you're in an organization, this is what I've learned, and I've been part of dozens of peer groups, and I've seen lots of different organizations and models. And if you're a part of an organization where vulnerability, where being honest and talking about not just your wins, but your struggles, if you're in an organization where that is shamed or looked down on or pushed out or rebuked, or if people back away when you do that, that organization is going to feed your imposter. That organization is going to make you feel more insecure. But if you can find community, if you can find organizations where vulnerability is not only allowed and accepted, but it's encouraged and celebrated and reciprocated, where when you say, I'm struggling, someone else will say, I'm so glad you said that because I'm struggling too, and let's talk about it. That is going to build you up, and that is going to suppress that. That's going to be a louder voice than that inner critic in your head. So here's what I've learned is that community without vulnerability will feed your imposter. It'll strengthen that voice, but community with vulnerability will starve it. It'll take away its power. And so if you can get connected and avoid that isolation, that is tactic number 2, and you can learn to look at failure as learning and to reevaluate your definitions of success and failure. That's that first tactic. You take away the weapons of the imposter. You take away all the ammunition. Because when the imposter says you're at risk of embarrassing yourself, you say, well, failure is learning. Well, you're at risk of you're a part of this group that intimidates you and you're the only one who doesn't measure up. And you say, well, I can open up and be vulnerable and that's going to help me. It's not going to hurt me. And you take away those fears that imposter wants to put into you. Now, I want to add one more piece to this, because vulnerability is not just about owning your weaknesses and admitting your fears and your struggles. It's also about accepting and owning your strengths. All right. One of the symptoms of imposter syndrome is the inability to accept a compliment at face value. So what we do is, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody here, I promise you, someone pays us a compliment and we say, oh, it's not that big a deal, or we make a joke, or we downplay it, or we say the bar is really low, or, we deflect that compliment with sarcasm, right? Sarcasm is my love language, by the way. So I have a hard time avoiding sarcasm. And how many of you have ever done that? Somebody said something nice about you and you just totally downplayed it. You deflected, you pushed it somewhere else. Yes. We've almost all done that, unless you're just a flat out narcissist. But I want to challenge you today. Have you ever considered that when someone pays you a compliment and you downplay it or deflect it, that you're actually insulting that person? What you're saying to them essentially is, you don't know what you're talking about. Your opinion is not valid, doesn't matter. I think I know this and you don't. And so my lower opinion is more important than your higher opinion of me. They've handed you a gift and you're essentially taking that gift and going, I don't really want it. What if we all agreed to just stop doing that? No more deflecting. All right. So here's what I want you to do. The next time someone pays you a compliment, and you guys, you in this group can try this on one another and challenge each other. The next time someone pays you a compliment, I want you to plant your feet, look them squarely in the eye and say, thank you. I worked really hard on that, and it's nice to know my work is appreciated. No qualification, no downplaying, no deflection, just accept it and own it. All right, because here's the thing that happens when you get vulnerable, when you're honest about your weaknesses, and then people still respect you, that respect starts to feel more real. You can accept the compliments when you've been honest about your struggles. But if you've got your game face on and you're pretending everything is awesome, and then someone tells you you're awesome, it'll be really hard to accept that because you don't believe they know the real you. You think, well, that compliment doesn't really count because it's only based on my sales pitch, and they don't know the reality. So these things are connected. If you are honest, then you can accept the praise when it comes. And when you start to accept, even when it's uncomfortable and you have to make yourself do it at first, but you start to accept those compliments, just take them and be thankful and grateful to the person who gave you that gift, you'll start to internalize it. And little by little, you'll actually start to believe it. And when you let those outside voices become louder than that inside voice that's trying to run you down, that voice will lose its power. That voice will lose its strength. That voice will lose its ammunition. So for the last several years, I have been on a journey, right? As I've learned about imposter syndrome, first of all, it was an eye-opening concept for me because I had experienced it a lot in my career. And then as I've been talking to people about imposter syndrome, as I've been sharing it with others, and several years ago, as I started speaking about it, the response that I got told me that this was a widespread and really pervasive issue, particularly among entrepreneurs and innovators and people that are pushing the boundaries and growing themselves. And so the reason that I wrote this book was not because I wanted to be an author, not because I was just trying to think of what can I write a book on. It really was because I read a lot. Number one, I told you I started my business by buying a stack of books. And so I read a lot and I recommend books all the time. And as I was learning about imposter syndrome and I started talking with some of my clients and my fellow entrepreneurs and realizing that other people were struggling too, I looked for a book that I could recommend that was written to and for and about people like me. And I'm not saying there hasn't been books written on imposter syndrome. There have, but there wasn't anything that I felt like was for me and my tribe, entrepreneurs and innovative people and people that are, that are achievers and are growing. And so it became a compulsion, quite frankly. I felt like this book needed to exist and it didn't. And so it became my assignment to write it. And I wrote it a couple of years ago, and I've been speaking and talking about imposter syndrome while continuing to battle it myself. Can I be honest with you and say that I had imposter syndrome about being an author as I was writing this book? And the fact that I wrestled with imposter syndrome while writing a book about imposter syndrome made me feel like I wasn't qualified to write a book about imposter syndrome. But I learned so much through this process. And now, some things have changed in my mindset. I've already told you that I look at failure as learning, and I approach new opportunities with a different attitude of it's not a risk. It's an opening. I'm either going to succeed or I'm going to learn. I can walk into a room of successful people that may intimidate me, that I may look up to or, aspire to be like, and I can actually feel like I belong there now. And I can look at that as not something to be afraid of, but as an opportunity. There's possibilities there. There's things I can learn from those people, and I shouldn't run away in fear. I should lean in to those situations. And one of the biggest learnings that I've had while writing this book, I went back and sort of, looked over my career and just was mining for stories and examples and illustrations. And I had this aha moment where I realized the moments that I felt the most insecure, the most at risk, the most fearful of what was going to happen, those were the moments that something incredible was happening. Those were the pivotal moments in my career, because I was among people that intimidated me, or I was trying something new for the first time. I was learning and growing and feeling that discomfort of, man, I'm really out of my element here, and I am not at all in my comfort zone, and there's so much risk. But those were the times that I was doing something great, or that something great was going on around me. And I had to either choose to lean in or to run away. And I'm so glad that in many of those times I chose to lean in and lean into the fear, lean into the worry, and suppress the insecurity and fight through it, because that's where the opportunities came from. So I have now learned to see that feeling, to recognize that feeling as a positive sign. When I feel imposter syndrome, when I feel like, oh, I may be getting in over my head here. Oh, I've been invited to a group that might be a little out of my league. Oh, I'm going to try this new thing, and there's a risk that it's not going to go well, and I may publicly fail. Even publishing a book, I knew there was a risk that it would be a big flop. But I've learned to see that feeling as a positive sign that I'm stretching, that I'm growing, that I'm doing something great. And so now when I feel that way, I say, oh, where's the opportunity? What am I learning? What am I growing? What am I stretching? And what am I doing? And it has been an awesome experience. And so I've learned to say, to accept compliments and internalize them. I've learned to reshape my definitions of success and failure, and to be more vulnerable, and even to lead with vulnerability in situations and see what happens and spark things in other people. Now, when I wrote this book, and when I wrote this speech, this talk that I've given now at conferences and events and for lots of different companies, I really wanted to, in that typical speaker fashion, I wanted to end with a big emotional story of triumph and sort of, give you that feeling of conquering at the end. And the problem is that the reality is that's not what overcoming imposter syndrome looks like. There isn't a moment where you strike the death blow, or you cross the finish line, or you reach the summit and hurrah, you've achieved it and you're done. Imposter syndrome is, and battling the imposter is something that the battle takes place in a million tiny decisions that you make on a regular basis. Right? First, it starts with awareness, which is which is what I've come here to give you today, right? To an understanding of that mental battle, of that fear of failure and that isolation and that inner critic and what's really going on there. But once you have that awareness, it's what you do with that awareness in a thousand little ways. Like when you lean into an opportunity that's risky, when you say yes to something, even though you're not 100% sure how it's going to work out. You know, when somebody's talking about a subject and rather than pretending like you know and going along, you say, hey, you know what? I don't know what that is. Can you explain that to me? I'd like to learn something here. This is an opportunity for me. And when you get honest and open up to someone about your struggles and your challenges, your fears, and when you share your ideas, even when they're not 100% thought through, they're maybe half baked and you don't know quite yet if you even believe it or not, but you just had a thought, and rather than holding that back, you lay it out and open it up for other people to discuss and give you feedback on. When you start to lean into that idea of failure is learning, and I need to be connected with vulnerability in order to be successful. And I will say it happens when you recognize the voice of the imposter at work in someone else, and you open up and tell them about your own journey, like I did with that young man, and you extend hope to somebody who may be struggling, isolated, fearful, and battling that all alone. You can be a person who changes the trajectory of somebody's life in one conversation just by opening up and sharing with them. I've seen it happen so many times, and it's incredible, and it will impact you. It's that conversation has impacted me, and I've never forgot it. So I want to do one thing, and then we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to ask you to think for a minute about what your imposter tells you. What is that narrative that goes through your mind? And then I want you to write the opposite of that statement. So an example might be, my imposter tells me that my lack of an education is going to hold me back and it's going to keep me from being successful. And the opposite of that is my lack of a traditional formal education is an asset to me because I have learned in other ways, and that has actually benefited me in my career. So what's your version? And I'd love it if some people would share, either write it into the chat, or if somebody wants to come off of mute and tell us, we don't need a long explanation because we don't have a ton of time left. Just give us the statement. Just say it confidently. This is what I believe now.
So mine is, just because I thought it doesn't make it wrong.
Ooh. Just because you thought it, that doesn't make it wrong.
Just because I created it and no one else did doesn't make it wrong.
So just because it's your unique idea doesn't mean that it can't. So your imposter tells you it can't be right if you're the one that came up with it.
That's right.
Very good, Scott. Thank you. Who else?
Good stuff here, Kris. Who else? Anybody, or you want to write it in?
All right. I know sometimes these things take some thought, and I just sprung that on you, so don't feel bad if you can't figure it out. But noodle on that, and maybe you can give yourself a new mantra, a new affirmation to remind you that that narrative going on in your head, it really is a fraud. It's a fake. It's an illusion. There's no one there. And you can decide, you can define where you're headed and what you're going to achieve. So we've got 4 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions of anything that I covered or about this imposter syndrome in general? Moose, I see your hand.
Just real quickly, the power of affirmation statements, or I am, statements. I think when something comes across, they're never going to join, I can't believe they want to drop out, it's like you have to every day, I think, reinforce the positive of all the good that you're going to do. And and like Scott says, moveon.com. If somebody wants to leave for whatever reason, it's just like, okay, because everybody is replaceable. And, sometimes you think, oh my God, I go through periods where my pipeline is very strong, and I don't use the word close. That was radio, but I convert is what I would prefer. They chose to become a member. And I think the power of affirmation statements, if I start getting stinking thinking for whatever, I'll say, let's stop that. Let's just do 4 affirmation statements about what I am, what I'm good at, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and why I love what I'm doing. And I think that sometimes can get you back on track more than not.
The narrative that you let play in your mind has a powerful influence on you. It really, really does.
Chris, you can tell by the comments in the chat that this has been very well received, and I appreciate you being vulnerable to deliver it. I want to hitchhike at the risk of giving away a few little trade secrets off of your vulnerability thing. When we created Network in Action, part of my goal was to create a little bit of vulnerability in many of the meetings. And so sometimes people looking at buying a franchise say, well, what do you do in a meeting? And I say, well, we don't walk across coal, we don't walk across glass and sing Kumbaya. But we do ask people to move to the front of the room sometimes to talk. We do start meetings by saying, what has your spouse or your significant other impacted your business? And it creates an opportunity for those that choose to be vulnerable. But here's what I love about it. It creates a far deeper connection, far quicker than all the elevator pitches you could do the rest of your life. Because when people share something that's sort of private, and then the whole group accepts them, the love starts and the desire to help each other. So creating vulnerability is an enormous part of what we encourage our franchise owners to do. And I see that the ones that are more willing to be vulnerable do it more often than the ones who aren't. So I love that. And I love the fact that I try to tell my kids, if you're completely real all the time, you'll find out who loves you.
Yes,
right?
That's
but if
true.
you're making stuff up, or you're fake or phony or an imposter, a real imposter, then you never really know. You never feel love. And this was part of my journey, Randy. So thank you for talking about your growth. I grew up in a highly dysfunctional Catholic family of 10. Great stuff, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So before we get off the phone, if any of you members will please write your mailing address in the chat, we will mail you one of Chris's books, Compliments of Network in Action Headquarters, Overcoming the Imposter. So please put your mailing address in the chat before we get off here. Chris, how can we help you going forward? You're looking for speaking opportunities? You like doing this?
So a couple of things. First, I want to say thanks, Scott, for offering to buy books for everyone. I would love for everybody to get a book. So please make sure to give Scott your address so that he can send you those. And yes, I am. So I'm a executive coach. I do leadership coaching mostly with business owners, entrepreneurs, and I'm doing a lot of speaking engagements on this topic. So if you are connected to a conference or an organization that brings in speakers for events and hire speakers to do keynote addresses and workshop style stuff, please introduce me or connect me or give them my name, tell them about the book, give them, once you've read the book, maybe share a copy, because I just really believe that this is a message that can transform people's lives, and I want to get it in front of as many people as possible. I'm not spending a ton of money on marketing, so I'm relying on people like you that read it and resonate and say, this helped me. I want to let it help someone else, to put this in the hands of other people, and especially people that can get me in front of larger audiences. So I would appreciate that very much.
Awesome. Thank you all for your time. I know it's the most precious thing you have. I say it all the time, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I know you all had 500 other things you could have been doing today, but I applaud you for being on here. And thank you all. We'll see you next month. Thank you, Chris, very much.
Thank you for letting me be here. I enjoyed it very much.
Bye.
Thanks.